First
Pleasure
of
to
all,
meet you.
same to you. And I've already passed on the hello from Craig Van Grastic, but I feel like I should pass it on in person now that we're meeting.
Yes.
He mentioned you quite a bit the last time we spoke because obviously you cross paths a lot. And he suggested I speak to you too, which suits me fine because I already know your fame in these circles. Um,
Uh-oh.
First of all, have you had your coffee? Excellent. I wouldn't know what to do otherwise with
Yeah.
myself. So I'll explain briefly what the hell I'm doing here anyway. So I'm a lecturer in psychology. I'm writing a book on the psychology of role-playing games. So my interest is a bit different from the standard historian's interest. So first of all, a fact check from me just to make sure that I've got my facts right. You have the honor of having played in Gary Gygax's Greyhawk, Dave Arneson's Blackmore, Phil Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne.
Yep. Back Phil was one of my D&D players for a while until he disappeared and said, I have an idea and came back with EPT.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah.
Okay. In fact, Craig told me the only thing that you probably didn't play was Dungeon, which was the game he was playing around the same time.
Actually I did play a few times with Dick Tatchy.
Oh my God. All right. So you've been in everything. Literally
Yep.
everything.
Just about well, and I'm the person who introduced Dave Sutherland to Gary Gygax.
Oh wow. Okay. All right. So you are quite close to the center of this web. So can I start with a very difficult question?
Sure thing.
What did you prefer, first of all, between war games, which is what you did previously before you started doing anything role-playing gaming, and then the new role-playing games that you were starting to play in 73, thereabouts?
That depends on when you're talking. And this is something trying to remember. Okay, in one of John's books, and I don't remember which one, he mentions that by the mid 70s, Dave Arneson had pretty much stopped running Blackmore. And I remember that from the other side. I do not exactly remember the dates. It was around 75 to 77. The College of St. Thomas and St. Paul had a gaming group that met Sunday afternoons. And Dave showed up occasionally to run battles that came out of his Napoleonic campaign. So he was back into his Napoleonic campaign by then. And if you read Rob Kuntz's book, Maryland the Magician, about Don Kay, hi, Rob, he mentions that by the time Don drew up his dungeon in late 1973, interest had already waned. And one of the biggest differences, and now not to say that we didn't plunge into role playing with both feet, but one of the biggest differences I've noticed over the years is that it was just one of the games we were playing.
Mhm.
And after I left Lake Geneva, I was part of the university gaming club at the University of Minnesota. Again, there were all kinds of things going on simultaneously. So I would say for about 2 or 3 years, we were in it up to our eyeballs. And then not so much lost interest as reacquired interest in doing some of the other things we'd been doing.
Okay.
And of course, currently I am living in a small town in a rural area in South Dakota where literally there is no, you have to drive an hour at highway speeds to get out of the cornfields. And there are a few gamers in town, but I'm not that fond of later editions, frankly, and lack the energy to run my own campaign. So right now I do a lot more wargaming,
Mhm.
but that has changed over the years.
Going back to your first experiences with the new thing, which was not wargaming, or which maybe was, depending on how you like to think about it or define these things. Initially, at least, what was your first thought about whether you preferred the new thing that people were playing around you, or if you wished everyone just went back to what they were doing before? This is just about you personally, of course, but
Right. I remember after the first night in Greyhawk Castle, going home and thinking, I have no idea what that game was that we just played, but it was the most awesome thing ever. And the almost totally free form nature of it, I think, had a lot to do with that. In I think it's in Dave Arneson, Rob's book on Dave Arneson. He talks about exploring shared imaginary space, and that was a big part of it. Or as Jim Ward said, he met Gary Gygax at a bookstore in Lake Geneva where he's looking at the Conan books. And Gary says, yeah, I've got a game where you can help Conan fight against the priests of Set. And it was the term role playing game didn't come up for several years. And it was like, this is kind of a cousin of wargaming, but not. Well, and skirmish wargaming, where you're playing one or a small handful of figures, had been known for a long time. Gladiatorial games had been around, so it was like you could see the roots in wargaming, but it was also something new, and we weren't quite sure what we had. And it was, well, it was immersive, and it was something new, and my grades in college suffered because of it.
I read Rob's books as well. I spoke to Rob a few weeks back. He was very handy. So hi, Rob, if you're watching this as well. And it's funny that you essentially have the same reaction that he had when he first played Dave Arneson's Blackmore, which is what the hell was that? Which is interesting because if there is such an overlap with wargaming, you wouldn't really expect that to be the reaction. You'd expect that to be, oh, this is a better thing than what I used to play. Um, is that fair?
Um, it's different.
Hmm.
Better is a word I hesitate to use.
Okay.
I don't, it was different, it was new, it was exciting, it was interesting. There's probably a 10-year period where I did almost nothing but role playing gaming. And now, my tastes have changed, and I'm not going to say good or bad, but tastes change. Most of my gaming is either at GaryCon or at EggCon, which is EggCon being the one that Heidi Gygax runs. Hi, Heidi. Hi, Eric. And I don't run role playing games at GaryCon anymore
Okay.
because people have said, people, whoever people are, have said, well, war gamers argue a lot. Well, I got a lot more argument out of people playing in my role playing games than I ever did in any of the war games I run. That is merely a personal experience, and proves nothing. It happens to be my personal experience.
Understood. So I've never been a
And
war gamer.
I should say there's one exception.
Mhm.
I have never had a bad time running the game Kobolds Ate My Baby.
I'm not familiar with this.
Oh, it's exactly what it says on the tin. And I suppose you could play it in a very dystopian way. If you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters,
No.
okay, in Screwtape Letters, the devil and his minions are entirely practical in that human souls are food. And the motto is bring back food or be food yourself. Kobolds Ate My Baby is about, the king of the kobolds, King Torg, all hail King Torg, sends you out to bring back food. And if you don't bring back food, he is going to feast on roast kobold. So you could play it a very dystopian, but any game that has a kobold random horrible death table and a baby random horrible death table is probably not meant to be taken seriously.
Hmm.
So that game, anybody who signs up for it knows what they're in for.
Yeah.
And we laughed so hard our ribs hurt.
There's also something interesting that Craig was saying, which was he said something along the lines of I'm sure he meant this in the nicest possible spirit, that he and his gamers were more humorous in their gaming, the actual style of gaming, than a lot of the people who were playing D&D itself were around the time. And that sense of humor rather than seriousness is something which I think we don't really explore very much. Some groups seem to hate humor in it and they want it to be really, really serious. And some want almost the opposite. And I'm sure there are many spaces in between.
Right.
Was that your experience early on that it was more humor filled than serious?
Well, okay, that's hard to say because, okay, Gary on the second level had a giant's bowling alley where these 60-foot tall giants are rolling 5-foot diameter boulders down this alley. And yes, it's humorous. Yes, it's kind of dumb fun. But on the other hand, if you got hit by one of those boulders, you were smushed. Dave Arneson had the Come Back In, where you pay your bill and you walk out the door and you turn around and come back in. So there was always an enormous amount of piss take in both Greyhawk and Blackmore. Now my personal, and this is purely personal, recollections, I didn't mind the silliness so much as in the original dungeon rules, there were some things I didn't like in the actual mechanics of the rules, I think possibly caused by my wargamer background. Like there were at least some spells that would only affect the bad guys, and if your own people were in range, it wouldn't affect them.
Okay.
And which is a minor thing, but there's a guy named Jim Wampler. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
No.
He's a cartoonist as well as a gamer. One of his favorite mottos is, "I didn't ask how big the room is. I said I cast fireball." Yeah. And coming out of wargaming, a 75 millimeter HE shell has such and such blast radius and does not distinguish who's in that blast radius.
Okay.
So, I
appreciate,
for lack of a better term, call it a grittier combat system. And they're nothing, purely a matter of personal taste.
understood. But it sounds like it's consistency that was important to you then. You want things to be consistent. What works for one works for the other, and doesn't work for one doesn't work for the other.
Right.
Right.
And I mean, I played Dungeon, had fun doing it. I had a dwarf character named Thorin Oakenhead. So I can place tongue firmly in cheek, whenever I want. I would say Craig is right, but it's not just in the venue of Dungeon versus other games. After several years on various fora online, there are people with all the sense of humor of a compound fracture. I remember somebody was complaining about all the dumb jokes in the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master Guide and Player's Handbook. Like the material component for the ESP spell is a copper coin. Penny for your thoughts. And I said, Gary liked dumb jokes. And if he had known that 40 years later you would be so upset about them, he would have put more dumb jokes in there. So, there, yeah, there are people with no noticeable sense of humor whatsoever. And, there, on the other hand, sometimes you'd like to be able to open the damn door and stop making, you know, that continuum, tails off on both sides.
Understood.
It's like one of my great regrets. There's a game out there called King Arthur Pendragon,
Hmm.
and it is the late Greg Stafford's love letter to Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur.
Hmm.
And I would love to play a game of that. But as much as I love Monty Python and the Holy Grail, if I'm playing Pendragon, I don't want it to turn into Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Just once, I'd like to be able to play that game with a straight face. And it's interesting you mentioned the psychological aspects, because I've been thinking about that for a while, and there are some very deep assumptions that I think people don't consider or even know about necessarily, and that come out of wargaming. And one of them is, okay, when you come up to the wargaming table, somebody's going to lose. Now, you want it to be those other buggers, but if you play war games, you are going to get handed your ass in a bucket from time to time. Last spring at GaryCon, I played a World War II scenario, and the other team coordinated better than we did, and we got waxed. And it happens. And that means that, well, and then you find out you cannot win a battle without exposing your troops to danger. And if you expose your troops to danger, you're going to lose some. Which meant that the first time I went down into Greyhawk Dungeon, I hoped we'd all come back, but I didn't think it was necessarily guaranteed. And even if we won, we wouldn't necessarily all come back. And another another thing that really, really influenced how people do or do not look at the game. Okay, the group in Lake Geneva mostly did miniatures wargaming, as did the Minneapolis group. And one school of miniatures gaming is just, okay, you each have so many points and you put together your army and you randomly dice for some terrain and you go at it. The way we played was more the referee would set up a scenario. And if you've read Rob's little monograph about Don Kay, he describes a World War II scenario that he played in where one side was some German home guard, basically old men and children, and the other side was American Rangers. And scenario, how do I put this? Scenario design was an art, and it was its own form of fun. Like, I have this idea for a scenario and I'm going to set it up and I'm going to see what happens when we play it out. And the scenario itself would include restrictions that were not made by the other player. One example of, when we're talking World War II, a very common example, pretty much, I think, all of the major armies developed tungsten core armor piercing shot that was in very, very short supply. So, you might, okay, you've got in the I don't know what it was, don't remember what it was called in other armies. The US called it HVAP, hypervelocity armor piercing. Like, okay, you have 3 rounds of this. And that's just one of the limitations the scenario puts on you. So when we went into the dungeon, yes, there's obstacles, there's traps, there's one-way doors, but that's just part of the scenario. Just like you don't have unlimited access to special ammunition, or there's a great lacking crevasse here where you really wish there was a bridge. That's just play the ball where it lies, as they say in golf.
So what for you was the big difference when you started playing Greyhawk? I mean, I know you said it was a shock, or hard to fathom, hard to describe. Looking back, what do you think the biggest difference was? The step change from war games in your experience, anyway.
Well, it felt emotionally different. um Part of it's like, in some sense, it was like a skirmish game, turned up to 11. If you're familiar with Mike Carr's Fight in the Skies, you had your pilot, and you had an interest in your pilot surviving and in your pilot getting better. So it's similar to that, but you know, but dialed up. And part of it too, even though Gary was not a big Tolkien fan, this was when Lord of the Rings was hitting just about its peak popularity. Lancer Books had just re-released the Conan stories. Yeah, and that's part of it too, is that fantasy literature was really big at that point. And if it had, there's another game that John mentions that we played a lot, Michael Korn's Modern Warfare in Miniature. And it has a lot of the same elements, but it was a fun game, and it was, really enjoyable, but it just didn't have that same grab. And why I lack the ability to articulate why it was different. But there was just, well, and this is purely spitballing. Part of it might be, I personally like my entertainment to be as escapist as possible.
Okay.
And you know, pic, picturing in your mind, deep in the depths of Greyhawk Castle, in this ancient crypt fighting mummies. That's a very vivid, very escapist, in a way that, ducking into a foxhole while machine gun bullets go over your head isn't. And
So
that's pure, that's not worth the paper it's not written on, but it just popped into my head.
no, I really appreciate that. It is a really hard question. I don't really expect there to be.
Right,
I don't think there is a correct answer anyway. It's part of what I'm trying to research. So
right,
one thing that really interests me about this is, so you mentioned the connection to the individual in the game, which is very different from wargaming, with the odd exception like Fight in the Skies. And there's a line in Men and Magic. I've kept it on my screen so I can just read this off about intelligence. So intelligence is the prime requisite for certain magical types. And then it's got the first reference, I think, to role playing, where role playing is disadvantageous that I found in any of the original D&D books, which is intelligence will also affect referees' decisions as to whether or not certain action would be taken, and it allows additional languages to be spoken. What I read into that is if your character has low intelligence, your great idea as a player can be discarded by the referee. Now, that doesn't fit with the idea of looking after your character as best as you can.
right.
It's a different spirit. Was that your experience back in the day?
It was in the text, but I never saw it implemented that way.
Okay.
Much like, in the war game scenario, the obstacles in the scenario you were expected to deal with, we just, we just dealt with things. Now, I don't know what would have happened if somebody had rolled a character with an intelligence of 5 or something like that. But for the most part, we were using the player's brain power, not the character's brain power. As opposed to, once, this was a few years back in some online forum, somebody said, don't make me figure out the puzzle. Just let me make an intelligence roll for my character.
Mm.
And that's not how I want to play.
Mm.
And there is the one for me, at least, one of the links that's between role playing and wargaming for me is in both media. At the end of the day, I want to feel like my decisions contributed to the success of the team, which can mean very different things in different situations. And, the old saw, the fighters are the line infantry and, the magic users are the artillery. Well, in most battle, in the Napoleonic period, it's the artillery that does the heavy work, but you got to have the line infantry there to hold the line. And which makes the whole idea of character balance look different. And that, somebody's like, boy, my artillery sure did wipe out a lot of enemy guys today. Yeah, but the center crumbled and we lost the battle. Or, okay, your poor bloody infantry didn't win the battle, but they're the ones that held the line and took it while the enemy tried to advance. You've different troops have different roles instead of concentrating entirely on how many points of damage can you do in a given turn.
Mm.
And the other, what does game balance mean? To me and to a lot of us, it means that any of the character choices are fun to play. And in 50 some years, I think I could count the number of Magic users I've played on one hand. They just don't interest me. And I've never got, I think I actually got one as high as 9th level once. Which now we go back to, I was talking about scenarios and limitations. I lose interest in Magic users because they fairly quickly reach the point where they've got whatever they need. As opposed to, you've got 3 tungsten core rounds, you'd better make them count. A lot of people have, and it's a matter of taste, a lot of people don't like Magic users loading out their spells in advance. It's just some people, and Frank Mentor is one of these. It's just like, okay, you've got one first level spell. When the time comes, you can decide whatever it is. For me, playing a Magic user, figuring out my loadout of spells is the most fun part. And you make them last as opposed to solving every encounter through magic.
Sounds like you like the
back,
challenge.
yeah,
Yeah.
back in the day, we'd encounter something, and if it was hostile, if there's going to be a fight, the first question was always, can swords handle this? Because swords are an unlimited resource. And you mentioned the challenge. Yeah, that's when I'm playing, for instance, a World War II game, I would rather play early war than late war. I'm very, very fond of World War II aircraft games. And, I find the early war much more compelling. If we're playing a World War II land battle, I will tend to prefer to play the Americans, not for any political reason, but simply because their equipment, 1-to-1, their equipment is nowhere near as good as the enemy's, and I enjoy the challenge.
Okay. Um, all right. Moving away from this is really interesting for me, and I've been thinking as we've been talking that intelligence is actually probably the hardest attribute to role play successfully in a game because it does effectively require a player not to play the game to the best of their ability. Whereas with strength and dexterity and all sorts of stuff like that, it's relatively
Right,
easy.
right.
Um,
And I also, in non-dangerous situations, I'm perfectly okay with somebody making suboptimal choices. But if we're down on the fifth level and trolls are gnawing on our legs, that that is not the time to start playing an idiot.
but I think
You know,
some people would say that, you have to play your idiot as an idiot the whole way through. What you gain in story makes up for what you lose in terms of characters. But
and
that's a view.
yeah, and I
But
am story is what you tell after this adventure is over. I have never, again, this is taste. I've never liked the idea of a pre-planned story.
hmm,
The as originally presented, it was here's a world. What do you do with it?
hmm,
And since and this is an old theatrical concept, and I don't remember where I heard it from. You know, every character in a scene has something they want,
yeah.
and they are going to do what they can to move events in the direction of what they want, even if it's just to get people out of your damn pub so you can go to bed. So if the referee knows what the NPCs want, the situation will develop itself. And it's all about how the players interact with the wants of the NPCs.
Okay. Entirely different line of question for a moment, if you don't mind. And of course, I'm very grateful for your time. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but whenever you need to stop, absolutely fine. Um, One thing that people don't really seem to talk about so much anymore because D&D and its related games are so popular these days, I mean, relatively speaking, is what it was like to be a gamer of these games around 73, 74. What other people's non-gamers' attitudes were to people who played this. And you said you spent about 10 years immersed in this, and you were very young when you started out playing these games as well. You
Yeah,
were,
like 16,
yeah.
15,
So
16. Well,
what was
okay,
it like?
high school was a misery for me anyway,
Okay.
totally irrespective of gaming. As I have said many times, Gary Gygax was the first adult who ever treated 16-year-old me like a peer. Well, then I hit college, and University of Minnesota at the time, there are 50,000 students on campus. So it's very easy to be lost in the crowd. And there was a gaming club. And in college, it's easy to hang around with a dozen friends and compatriots and, you know, ignore the rest of society. And, my, I have I'm in a very strange age cohort in that by the time 1980 rolled around and the whole is D&D satanic thing came up, I was 25. I graduated from college. I was married for the first time. What some wingnut woman down south thought affected me personally not at all. I know a lot of other people had vastly different experiences. But other than the normal, you know, when I was young and couldn't drive yet, getting to games was a bit of a hassle. But other than that, I never really, gaming or not gaming, never had much of an impact. Just most of my friends and compatriots were gamers, and I didn't give a crap about some random person on television. So that was my personal experience.
Okay. So, in your view, and it's related, what differentiated gamers and yourself from non-gamers in that period of time, in the early 70s, societally speaking? Was there a big difference in your view? And this is, of course, a matter of introspection and, as you said earlier,
Yeah.
spitballing. But do you have a
Yeah.
view on that?
Uh, like I said, I went to the university, moved 300 miles away from home, went to the University of Minnesota, connected up with the wargaming club there very early, and sort of proceeded to live my life through that lens. Most, I met those people, and then I found out, the Littleton Soldier Shop, which was another gamer's paradise. So the people there was some condescension, especially I noticed from young women about our age, thinking, you're playing with toy soldiers and how childish. And say, yeah, well, I am. So what? I, I, I personally, again, very early on, seem to have evolved the attitude of, if you look down on my hobbies, that says more about you than it does about me. And as an introvert anyway, and a misanthrope and a curmudgeon in training, my grandfather was teaching me to be a curmudgeon when I was 7 years old. Yeah, if someone looked down on my hobby, I simply did not care. It's like, okay, that just means you're somebody I don't need to spend any energy on.
Fair enough. Um, I have two final questions for you, if that's okay. One difficult, one easy.
Okay.
Um, Difficult one is, of the three gaming groups that you were in, Greyhawk, Blackmore, Empire of the Petal Throne, which did you enjoy the most and why?
Oh, well, that's
And of course, it's personal opinion and it's whatever you felt.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. It's tough because they were so different.
that's interesting in itself. Even though Gygax, Arneson, and
Okay.
Marbach were all working together within the space of about a year, you still felt that the campaigns were so different.
Yeah, Gary Gary loved the Middle Ages, and Greyhawk did have a medieval flavor. Dave was a now we would use the term gonzo. Dave was a very gonzo referee in that you never knew what the hell was going to happen. Phil Barker, sometimes when he was on, he was a fabulous referee, but unlike Gary, it wasn't his full-time job. And he had a lot of other things going on. One thing I did not, there's only one thing I didn't like about Gary's refereeing, in that he was too fond of Jack Vance's Dying Earth.
You
Now,
don't like
I
the
don't know,
magic system.
pardon?
You didn't like the magic system, is
Oh,
that?
no, no, Magic System was fine. But have you ever read the Dying Earth
But yeah.
stories? Okay. In a dozen short stories and three novels, I think there's like three people who you could actually consider good people,
Mm.
and maybe another three or four people who are okay, they'll treat you how you treat them. And everybody else is an absolute son of a bitch.
So it's morally ambiguous. Is that fair?
Oh, no. Oh, no. There's no ambiguity at all. I mean, on Dying Earth, okay, there are people who will not betray you. And then there are people who will betray you if it gets them something. On Dying Earth, 90% of the people will betray you even if it costs them something just for the sake of betraying. And they are they are jerks for the sake of being jerks. And Gary was a little too fond of that paradigm for his NPCs. Like that, and Phil Barker was the same way, unfortunately, to the point where Phil actually drew one of the maps for Jack Vance of the Dying Earth. And he and Jack Vance were friends. In fact, I remember the day, it would have been either late 70s or early 80s, when he got an early copy of Vance's book, Kujul's Saga, which was his second full novel on Dying Earth. Hardcover, personalized, signed copy arrives in the mail. Now, I like Dying Earth. It's a great set of books, but I would not live there for anything.
Okay. And there was too much of that in the Gygax campaign
Yeah,
and less of it
yeah,
in the Arneson.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Final question is an easy one. I think it might be easy, it might not be. Um, but it's very open. What do you think was the best thing about role-playing games as you experience them?
Well, there's some obvious things like the fact that I made friendships that have lasted 50 years or more. But
Can I just say, I don't think that's that obvious. I mean, if you consider people playing Monopoly 50 years ago and how many of them are still friends now, I don't think they'd say the same. Is that fair?
true, but then again, do they just play Monopoly occasionally, or are they part of a Monopoly club?
Fair point.
Because I've discovered that's very. I mean, we could have several more conversations on tangents from this, but the fact that I was a member of a club, not only just in Lake Geneva, but at the university, every Tuesday night from 1973 to 1988 or 1989, that in itself is so rare and hugely affected how I look at gaming. And the sort of things we did, we ran, I don't know how many different campaigns of different kinds that could go on for a year or more. And everything from World War II to medieval to Star Trek. A war between the Federation and the Klingons that went on for 2.5 real years, and had like 15 or 20 players on a side. That's I have come to realize how extraordinary that is.
Okay.
And but once I said earlier that I want to feel like my character, you know, the decisions I make, whether on the war game table or in a role playing game, contribute to the success of the team. But in role playing, I have had a few experiences that you just don't get. You don't get in war games, where it just, the only way to describe it is that was awesome. And I will give you one example. This was a Star Trek role playing game, and that's a hard genre because everybody has to have similar ideas of what Star Trek means, and it can mean a lot of different things. But we managed to find, 6 or 7 of us that had sufficiently compatible views. And it was kind of funny because, we're portioning out places on the bridge, and it's like, I don't want to be the captain. No, I don't want to be the captain. I'm like, excuse me, center seat or nothing. And tying into the war games, in one of these Star Trek war games, I had Federation starship captain, Jonathan Armstrong, known as Jack Armstrong, the All Federation boy, which is a callback to a 1930s radio series called Jack Armstrong, the All American boy. So I had Jack Armstrong, the All Federation boy. So roll forward, we're playing in the role-playing campaign, and at one point, the referee says, come an hour early. So I did, and basically, the captain is abducted and a doppelganger put in his place. And my medical officer, she played a half human, half Vulcan. She was the ship's doctor. So I said, okay, the doppelganger has a pretty good layer of knowledge, but not perfect and not emotionally a duplicate. The situation gets more and more tense. And I don't remember what the doctor said, but, cueing from the Star Trek episode, What Are Little Girls Made Of? Doctor says something. I said, I've had just about enough out of you, you half-breed bitch. And the player goes, that's not the captain. And, for that moment, and everybody else is like, you're right. And, for that moment, the bridge crew of the Starship Concorde was a real thing. And unlike some people, I don't think you can plan for that. As I said, when Pat Kilbane interviewed me for Dreams in Gary's Basement, we're talking about why did this catch on? Sometimes lightning strikes. And lightning is a wild element that cannot be controlled.
So it provides the opportunities for the lightning that other games don't. Okay.
As a working hypothesis, I'd go with that. I don't know if I can scientifically prove it, but it sounds like a good hypothesis to start with.
I'm sure we've got no chance of scientifically proving that, but I really appreciate this, your time, Michael, and the conversation was really interesting. I feel like I've learned a good amount as well.
Good. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
to help.
If there's anything I can do in return, empty though it probably sounds.
Number?
Sorry?
Winning lottery number?
I don't play it, but okay. I'll remember.
Passport so I can get out of this country. No, not going to get political. Well, and the whole question of the perception of people who started in wargaming as opposed to the people who only came in through role playing and have never done any other kind of gaming, is enormous.
Mm.
Um, I mean, we played everything from gin rummy to Risk to fairly detailed war games and everything in between. Oh, brain cell just fired. Something that I think is important, and this is something John Peterson actually missed. In the 1960s, I don't know how else to put this other than say war was popular. And what I mean by that, okay, there was a TV show called Combat about World War II soldiers that went on for something like 6 or 7 seasons. Well, since the World War II soldiers were in their mid 40s, it's not, you know. TV show 12 O'Clock High about the B-17 bombers in England. Toys. You look up, I think Remco 1973 or 1963, the Johnny Reb cannon. Excuse me, my Milton Bradley did, they had Broadside, which Mike Carr still uses the ships from, and they had a tank battle game, and they had Dogfight and Stratego. And these are, mass market games that are advertised on television nationwide for kids under 12. Dogfight was a fairly simple game compared to Fight in the Skies, but it's still recognizably World War I aircraft combat. So that is also part of the stew of popular culture that was going on at the time. 1966 or 1967, I think Mattel comes out with a toy M16. That was in the air, and I think that probably provided part of the ground that those seeds fell on.
Mm.
And then you take that and you add the incredible popularity of Lord of the Rings. And as you said, this is the opportunity for lightning to strike.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that there's an element of the cultural background influencing the development of games. I mean, it's obvious, really, isn't it? It doesn't require a book to be written about it. It's pretty obvious. I mean, the timelines alone tell you how that works. Um, yeah, it's definitely something I need to get into more. Um, all right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate it. I hope you have
Certainly.
a good rest of your day. And
Thanks.
yeah, if there's anything I can do, please do let me know. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you at GaryCon. I think I'm going to go in March. So if you're going there, I'll see
Oh,
you there.
that would be awesome. Make sure that you stop by the Legends of Wargaming room, which is where I spend the vast majority of my time. And if you're really lucky, I'll let you buy me a beer.
Superb.
And if you have time, I invite you to play in my game Rocket Ships exclamation point, and the words exclamation point are part of the title, which is yeah,
Yeah, I
a
follow.
spaceship combat game with tongue firmly in cheek, but yet still fun to play. Which
I'm
Tom
honored.
Wham, if you've ever heard the name Tom Wham,
Yes.
he is a master of games with a humorous setting that still have a core of amazing gameplay. So I recommend anything Tom comes up with.
Thank you, Mike. I'm honored. I will get you that bit. If I'm there, I'll get you that bit.
Well, thanks for your time. If if you think of more questions, feel free.
Thank you. You're very kind. Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye bye.
Farewell.